Okay, here's my low-tech solution to showing you guys a little bit about how to read Charles Dickens a little easier. I'm guessing that after reading the first 4 chapters, you might feel a little bit like, wow, that was kind of hard, kind of difficult to understand what he's saying and to follow along with his thoughts. So this video is about how to do that. You're going to notice I'm going to do a little bit of a Star Wars screen scroll with the text here. Very low tech. First off, I'm going to start us with some sentences that take place right as Mr. Lorry is meeting Miss Manette. It's in it's in book 1, chapter 4. And there's 4 sections or 4 sentences in a row that I think show a variety of different techniques that you'll need in order to be able to read Dickens really well. So first up, the first technique here is to recognize depth. We'll read these first few sentences and highlight any literary devices or techniques that we might observe. And you're obviously not going to do this actually by writing out when you're reading, but you want to be recognizing this because sometimes students wonder what the purpose of some of these sentences are. Like so. It was a large, dark room furnished in a funereal manner with black horsehair and loaded with heavy, dark tables. These had been oiled and oiled until the 2 tall candles on the table in the middle of the room were gloomily reflected on every leaf, as if they were buried in deep graves of black mahogany, and no light to speak of could be expected from them until they were dug out. Okay, I can see students kind of glossing over as they read that, but there's a lot here. First thing I want to do is start to kind of pick out some words that maybe I don't really understand very well. Usually students might not know this word as well, funereal. It means funeral-like. And let's see, are there any other words? Probably not. The word leaf here refers to a leaf in a table. Some students are familiar with this and some are not. If you have a dining room table that actually has sections of wood that you can take out of it to make it shorter, or you can add them back in to make them longer, those are called leaves. It's the leaf in a table. And so that's what's being described right here. So another observation that usually people come up with is they notice the presence of gloomy, dark language. Just to highlight for us words that emphasize that darkness, we've got dark, we have black horsehair, we have the funereal manner, we have heavy dark tables, gloomily, buried, deep graves, black mahogany, no light. Okay, just in that short little bit, Dickens is clearly using a lot of dark and gloomy imagery, and I think a good question we should be asking if we're good readers is why? Why the dark imagery? And in this case, she's here to find out that her father is actually alive, and there's something, and that he's been compared. Her father has been compared to as if he's been buried alive before. And so there's something dark, something kind of ghostly about this scene, and the way that Dickens describes the setting is meant to fit that. Also, if we look at it, he says these had been oiled and oiled. The these here would be the tables. And so Dickens describes the tables as oiled and oiled until 2 tall candles on the table in the middle of the room were gloomily reflected on every leaf. Well, you can imagine looking down a long wooden table at 2 candles, and that the reflection on the table would look like the candles were also underneath, as if they were buried. They is referring back to the candles, okay? As if the candles were buried, and in deep graves of black mahogany, no light to speak of could be expected from them until they were dug out. This, on the surface, is about the candles, but really Dickens is talking about something else. He's talking about Monsieur Manette. He's talking about Lucy Manette's father, and that perhaps, like the candles, that he's been buried in a deep grave, and no light to speak of could be expected from him until he was dug out. So what does no light mean? Some ideas might be that perhaps he's not going to be himself for a very long time until he comes out of this. Perhaps there's no love or joy in his life to be expected until he gets dug out or released from the prison that he's been in. Those are that's sort of some of the depth that's here. Moving forward, there's another strategy here. The next sentences say, the obscurity was so difficult to penetrate that Mr. Lorry, picking his way over the well-worn Turkey carpet, supposed Miss Manette to be, for the moment, in some adjacent room, until, having got past the 2 tall candles, he saw standing to receive him by the table between them and the fire a young lady of not more than 17, in a riding cloak, and still holding her straw traveling hat by its ribbon in her hand. Wow. Okay, so that's a lot. It's even hard to do that with just one breath here. I'm out of breath just reading it. So if you're reading it silently to yourself, you might get lost in that sentence. If you wanted to help yourself with that, though, you can, if you get to a sentence that you get lost in the middle of, try to trim it down mentally. Please don't actually draw in your books, but you can trim it down mentally to get rid of anything that's unnecessary. So I've got, the obscurity was so difficult to penetrate that Mr. Lorry, okay, and then I can cross this out, picking his way over his well-worn Turkey carpet. What did Mr. Lorry do? He supposed, what? He supposed Miss Manette to be, I can take out for the moment, in some adjacent room, until, and now I can get rid of the having got past the 2 tall candles, he saw standing to receive him by the table between them and the fire. How about he saw a young lady of not more than 17, and then in a riding cloak and still holding her straw hat and so forth. The rest of that isn't unnecessary, but grammatically it's unnecessary. I don't need that to understand the sentence. It does add detail, and it helps me envision what does Miss Manette look like while she's in a riding cloak, still holding her straw traveling hat and so forth. So I'm not saying that Dickens is wrong to include that, but if I'm struggling to read this, I might trim this down to, the obscurity was so difficult to penetrate that Mr. Lorry supposed Miss Manette to be in some adjacent room until he saw a young lady of not more than 17. Okay, so that gets me to the core of the sentence and helps me with my comprehension. Another strategy that's similar is to locate the action by locating the independent clause. Here's a long one. As his eyes rested on a short, slight, pretty figure, a quantity of golden hair, a pair of blue eyes that met his own with an inquiring look, and a forehead with a singular capacity, remembering how young and smooth it was, of rifting and knitting itself into an expression that was not quite one of perplexity or wonder or alarm, or merely of a bright fixed attention, though it included all 4 expressions. As his eyes rested on these things, a sudden vivid likeness passed before him of a child whom he had held in his arms on the passage across that very channel one cold time when the hail drifted heavily and the sea ran high. Okay, so locating the independent clause here is going to help me. The independent clause is quite simply a sudden, vivid likeness passed before him. And then there's phrases attached to that clause, but the likeness is the subject, and what's it doing? It's passing before him. Everything else in this sentence is dependent upon that word as, which makes it all dependent, a bunch of dependent clauses here. As this is happening, as this is happening, as his eyes rested on these things. So while, again, that's all useful information to know, especially all this stuff about Lucy's forehead, it's really, what do I need to know to move on to the next sentence and comprehend what's happening? That a sudden vivid likeness has passed before him. In other words, a vivid likeness is like a vivid image of something that he's seen before, a similarity passed before him. And what is he remembering? He remembers a time that he carried a child across that very channel, the English Channel, one cold time. Okay, in other words, he once brought Lucy Manette from France back to England, and he's remembering that vivid memory right before his brain. And now, returning to our first strategy here at the end, recognizing some depth, says, the likeness passed away like a breath along the surface of the gaunt pier glass behind her, on the frame of which a hospital procession of Negro cupids, several headless and all cripples, were offering black baskets of Dead Sea fruit to black divinities of the feminine gender. And he made his formal bow to Miss Manette. Okay, again, we could totally get lost on this one. I'm not going to get too much into the depth of this, and honestly, for this stuff here, you might look to Discovering Dickens for detailed descriptions of what Dickens is alluding to. But for our purposes, the likeness passed away, okay? The likeness is the likeness up here, and it passed away, it went away. But I noticed that the word passed away is another image of death, okay? And we're going to notice a similar pattern as above. Like breath along the surface of the gaunt pier glass behind her. So here's a simile, and I want you to picture when you breathe on a mirror, a gaunt pier glass is a mirror, and you watch the breath fade away. That's the way that the image faded away from Mr. Lorry. And it says that, by the way, that mirror was behind her. There really is a mirror behind her, on the frame of which, so the frame of the mirror, there's a hospital procession of Negro cupids, several headless and all cripples. So we have headless, cripples, black baskets, Dead Sea fruit, black divinities, all of these things. Again, the images of both darkness and also, in some ways, we have cripples, we have headless, we have passed away, Dead Sea, we have death in there too. Again, he's surrounding this passage with as many descriptions of darkness and death as he can, as it is this sort of gloomy mood he's creating. Now, why literally is everything black there is because the frame of the mirror must be black. That's why he describes the cupids that are carved into the frame as Negro cupids, and then the black baskets and the Dead Sea fruit and the black divinities. All of these things are black because they are literally on a black frame. Okay? Anyway, those are some variety of techniques. You're going to want to recognize depth at times. At times you want to trim a sentence down for yourself mentally, and other times you just need to locate the action of the sentence to get a clear, a fluid way to read it for yourself. Hope that helps.